Again, thank you all for joining us today on our webinar. We're actually doing this at a couple of different times today to try and span the globe, so to speak. So this is our first one, and we'll be doing another one here a bit later on today. So again, thank you all for joining. We're going to be talking about bridging the divide. How do we bring IT security into the realm of OT? We'll spend probably about 50 minutes or so, and then we'll have time, hopefully, to open it up for questions at the end. We're here. Oh, there we go. So quick introduction. I'm John Livingston. I'm the CEO of Verve Industrial. I spent about 20 years of my career with a firm called McKinsey & Company, consulting to large industrial companies around technology transformations. And I spent the last 5 years at Verve helping lead our growth and serving clients in the range of cybersecurity in industrial environments. Who are we? We are a software company that provides software and services specifically to the OT or ICS world around cybersecurity. We've been doing this for roughly 25 years. And we've got a team that has both IT and OT experts. So we sort of live this, this divide, so to speak, right within our own organization. Just some context for the way we come at this problem and how we see it. So first of all, as I mentioned, we've been doing industrial controls programming for almost 30 years now, meaning our team is a group of people who actually go into plants and infrastructure and will do programming of SCADA, DCS, PLCs, et cetera. So we come at this from a deep understanding of these OT systems, and not just individual vendors, but pretty much across all the different OEM vendors. Our team is built of that group of OT experts plus a group of IT software folks who have lived in the IT realm for most of their careers. And so we brought these two groups together to try and think through how to address this specific problem. We've been deploying our cybersecurity solution for over a dozen years on all sorts of different OEM systems. And so we've learned what works and what doesn't, what you can do and what you can't do in these environments. That platform, and we'll talk a little bit about it today, but today's less of a discussion of our platform and more a discussion of the problem and how to solve it. Basically adopts that OT knowledge in the technology and brings, essentially allows IT technologies to work in the OT environment. And so we're consulting with a whole bunch of different industries, everything from pharmaceutical manufacturing, oil and gas, chemicals, water, power, electric utilities, transportation, et cetera, around this topic. And we're helping them sort of transform, I guess, their security maturity. So we've sort of lived through this ourselves, and we've got lots of various case studies of clients who have been trying to address this fundamental challenge of how do I achieve IT level security in the OT world. So what do we hear typically when we get involved? So oftentimes we hear things like, well, you can't do the same things in OT as in IT. The equipment's too old, it's too sensitive, it's just different. We hear that the OEM vendors are really responsible for security. And you know, we've basically outsourced this to those guys because they built the system. And you really can't have one security capability inside our company because each vendor needs its own kit, so to speak. OT resources, you know, a lot of times we hear from IT folks, OT resources just don't get security. They don't understand it. It's not part of their culture and background. And they just think about things differently. From the IT side, we often hear, from the OT side, we often hear IT always is screwing up our systems. They're coming in and changing our firewalls without telling us. They're patching systems and tripping our plants, et cetera. We then hear things like, you know, I just want to have one SOC. Just give me a SOC and let me push all of my alerts, et cetera, into it. And then the whole cultural differences. We're just very different people. And so we struggle with bringing them back. And then over on the right-hand side here, we're hearing this less and less, so it's getting smaller and smaller, but there is still the group occasionally that you know says, well, I'm air gapped, I don't need to worry about this. I think the COVID and remote work is sort of pretty much blowing up that theory, but still we hear it sometimes. So these are some of the things we heard, and actually in some of the questions that we got before the before this webinar, we heard some of these same questions around how do I deal with different types of devices, or how do we bridge the cultural gap? How do we build the skills? And so we're going to try and cover a number of these questions as we go through this today. So let's start with one of the questions that came in is, okay, let's talk about some of the growing threats or changing threats in our landscape. Well, we refer to this as sort of 4 drivers as RAID. What's growing? What is the pressure that's growing on the CISO? And there's really coming from 4 directions we see. First is regulatory pressure. And this is happening all over the globe, whether it be in the GCC countries, whether it be in Europe, in the US. Chile has now just implemented a set of regulations like NERC-CIP here in North America. And so regulators are realizing that they need to do something to ensure protection of critical infrastructure. Attackers, and we'll talk more about this, but the attackers are increasing their presence. 45% increase in OT vulnerabilities last year. We've looked at through all the vulnerability releases from things like ICS CERT, et cetera. So 45% increase, but 75% of those came from third parties, which is great in some ways. It means more people are researching and publishing, but we know that if that many third parties are researching and publishing, there's an equal number or more researching and not publishing and intending to do harm. Then insurers. So I was literally just talking with the insurance company yesterday, and their growing fear that they are actually insuring things that they don't understand, that they don't even know that they're insuring. And they're now coming to the table and saying, wait a minute, what about that other half, so to speak, of all of your infrastructure that we're essentially insuring, but you aren't protecting? And so they're bringing that on. And then the D is the data requirements. So as industrial internet, industry 4.0, whatever we want to call it, remote access grows, the need for that data grows, the air gaps, the limitations of connectivity are starting to fall. More vendors are requiring real-time access, not just for outbound data, but now for inbound control. And as a result of that, the risks to these systems grow as the air gap falls and the proliferation of connections grows. And so the CISO, or whoever the person is responsible in that organization for cybersecurity, is now realizing we have to solve that problem. They may have realized it before too, but more and more are coming to the recognition that we have to solve that problem. And it's not just enough to say we have a network protection at the perimeter, and that's good enough. So the risks are growing. So this is some of our research from last year, roughly a 30% increase in the number of advisories, a 40% increase in the critical advisories, and a 47% increase in the number of CVEs, of the actual vulnerabilities. And so they're growing and they're becoming ever more risky. And then just in 2021 so far, we've had a number of public attacks. And we just saw Molson Coors announce things. In fact, Honeywell announced, not clear yet, Honeywell's was an OT or an IT thing. But more and more of these attacks are impacting the OT environment. And those threats, those types of risks are of various types. So a lot of folks focus on this third group, the Stuxnets of the world, right? These advanced Trisis type things, the advanced attackers, the nation states, APTs. But the reality is that a lot of these attacks end up from collateral damage. What we mean by that is when ransomware, for instance, hits the IT side of an organization, it spreads through into OT. And in fact, those are much more likely than some of these more advanced APT type attacks. Now, they may not be as problematic. You might be able to recover faster. You probably aren't causing a plant to blow up, et cetera. By the same token, when you do your risk and severity and likelihood, the total impact may be greater, and the financial impact can be quite substantial. I know roughly $1 billion for some of these that have happened, like the Merck attack from a couple of years ago. So as we think about this, we can't just say it's OT only. We have to think about this bridge between IT and OT. And that's really what this chart shows. So a typical quote unquote OT ransomware, almost all of them don't start at a PLC, they're starting in IT, right? Whether it be through a phishing campaign or something like that. And ransomware gets planted on the IT side, it then exploits vulnerabilities. It may be used to gather, part of the malware may be gathering credentials, but even in many cases, it's not gathering credentials, it's just going through weak firewalls or no firewalls, flat networks, and jumping into the OT side. And then once it gets there, in most cases, there's a significant lack of patching, all of the things that we would think of as IT security, patching, configuration management, AV, whitelisting, et cetera, aren't present in OT. And so it spreads very quickly across that OT landscape. But it's rare so far that the ransomware has come in directly through the OT side. And so we need to think not only about protecting those IT systems so it doesn't get a foothold, but also finding ways to make sure that we have both the crunchy outside, I'll call it, the ACLs, the firewalls, network protections, et cetera, but also not a squishy inside, right? So a hardened endpoint and inside protections. And all of that comes back to applying fundamental core IT security principles within the OT environment. So what would you need to do that? Well, again, you would need to have these fundamental IT type security policies. You'd want to stop it initially with network separation and segmentation. You'd want to make sure you have updated patching on the OT side, and that's going to require some form of automation, some form of vendor agnostic patching, so you're not relying on dozens of different vendors to do your patching. Protecting user accounts. One of the things we see most frequently is just a wide variety of whether they be admin accounts or service accounts, et cetera, that are on these systems that no one's sort of bothered to clean up over time. You'd want to have standard secure configurations. Many OT environments don't have AD, but you have to find some way to get those configurations hard. And I can go down this list, but a number of things that, if you read this, sound a lot like what we do in IT security today, but hasn't crossed over. The great news is that there are a set of standards, frameworks, et cetera, that have been developed over time on the IT side, right? So this is we've taken the CIS top 20, for example, and we've laid that over the NIST cybersecurity framework. Again, we could do a dozen of these different frameworks. They tend to come down to the same basic principles, starting with identify, right? Know what you have, know the risks you have. So inventory management, whether it be hardware and software, access control, configuration baselines, knowing what your network connectivity and rules are today, not just what they were designed as, but what they are today. Vulnerability assessments, et cetera. So know your risks. Then on the protection side, things like patching, standard secure configuration, anti-malware, segmentation, et cetera. Obviously, it can't all be done with protection. So the detection part, making sure that your systems are logging, monitoring configuration changes. We have one great advantage in the OT world, which is we have process alarms, right? And a whole industry and practice built up around physical process alarms. So bring that in too. That's another great detection vehicle we find. Response, and then obviously recovery, where understanding your backup status, knowing that you have the ability, the ability to recover if necessary from backup. Again, standard in some ways in IT. Oftentimes we find when we first go into clients, backup solutions are not there, or alternatively there, but they're not used in as rigorous a way potentially as might be necessary. And so we have these sets of frameworks, we have rules, standards, controls, whatever you want to call them. And so the question is, how do we go from this on the IT side to making that work in OT? And so what we hear mostly from our client CISOs is, look, can you give me the same capabilities in IT? Can you give me that patch management across all my software? Can you give me hardened configs? Can you give me something that can update my user and account management, even if it's not connected to my corporate AD servers? Let me know all of the software on my system, not just what's communicating, but every piece of software that's on there. And I can go down the list here, right? So give me those same capabilities, but tune it so that it's safe, because I understand these systems are different. I understand that I can't do things the exact same way in OT as I do it in IT, but can I achieve the same conclusion, so to speak, the same objective? So, make sure it's proven. I can't go into a plant and tell the plant manager and the folks who are running my process controls that this is the first time it's ever been done. I can't be scanning things. I know that. I've tripped plants before where I've knocked PLCs offline by trying to scan things. Get me appropriate coverage, because I've got embedded devices, I've got Windows devices, I've got networking. Each device type is going to need probably a different approach. So make sure it covers all of that. I need to be able to act. So, but act in a way that's safe for the OT environment, that recognizes the sensitivities of each of those environments and recognizes the skills and knowledge of the process control people for that environment of what can be done and what can't. There's a lot of unique OT vulnerabilities. We just talked about all of those that came out of ICS CERT. I got to be able to see those vulnerabilities. I got to know what the vulnerability is on that PLC, that RTU, that controller, not just what the latest Adobe vulnerabilities are. And then finally, probably the biggest one, so the number one challenge that we hear, KPMG just did a big survey on this, the number one challenge is talent, and then the amount of resources to do this. It's less budget, it's more people. And so, how do I do this in a way that reduces the labor requirements? This is what we hear, right? Give me this, but make it do that. And so we're going to talk now, pivot to a little bit about how you can do that. We know there's differences. IT and OT are very different. I won't spend a lot of time on this page. My guess is most of the folks, if you've decided to join this webinar, know these differences, but there are differences, right? And we have to be cognizant of those differences when we start to deploy IT-like solutions into the OT environment. So how do they do that? So the first is, we need to think about being vendor agnostic. We need to understand those OEM systems, but know what you can do as well as what you can't do. And we'll expand on that. Number two, it has to include 100% endpoint visibility. So it's not enough to say, well, I can see the devices that communicate to the top network, but I don't see things that communicate internally, or I only see things that communicate. I don't see things that don't communicate right now. So having that 100% visibility to not just the hardware, but also all of the software that's sitting on that hardware. Whatever that solution is, has to be able to actually manage those assets. And I think we as an industry have done a poor job of defining terms. Management is more than visibility. Visibility is, I know it exists, I can update it, I can update the information I have, but I can't do anything with it. Management means I'm actually taking an action on that device. I'm patching it, I'm hardening configuration, I'm removing a user, I'm closing a port. Without the ability to manage what we would refer to as OT systems management, you're then just glasses, or you're the dentist in the ad that then actually can't fix the cavity. So management, we believe, has to include the actionability, not just the visibility. It then has to enable response and recovery, confirmed and available backups, log data that you can use in the OT environment, not just logs that go forward to some central Splunk server someplace that someone in an offshore SOC is monitoring, but something that the OT team can actually use to do incident response. an architecture that we call think global, act local. And what we mean by that is an architecture that would allow you to scale your resources for analysis, but then when you go to make those actions, brings the OT experts, the process control experts, into the action, and make sure that they are the ones who are kind of taking the last, pulling the trigger, so to speak, in the last mile for those actions. And then finally, partnering between IT and OT to split up the tasks. This is not IT can do it or OT can do it. Our view is you have to have IT and OT working together to do this. And we can talk about some case studies we've had of organizations that have really done that well and brought IT and OT together. The point is you can do it, but it takes a specific approach and a mindset of executives to be willing to quote unquote break some of the rules and think differently. So let me start with, I'm just gonna take a drink here. Let me start with a quick case study. So we've done dozens and dozens of these over the last few years. This is one particular example. In this case, it was an electric utility, and they decided that they wanted to achieve the CIS, the Center for Internet Security, top 20 security controls, sometimes known as CSE 20. And that was going to be their standard. They had a variety of regulatory requirements, NERC, SIP, and others, but they decided that as an entity, they wanted to set a standard and achieve that across the board, IT and OT, every endpoint. They set a very, very tight timeline, basically a 9-month period of time to do it all. It sounds crazy, but that was their timeline. And they had dozens of plants and transmission equipment, et cetera. They needed to deliver not just the one time, but a maintenance and a monitoring of that compliance with the CIS top 20 over time. They had a whole bunch of different OEM equipment, like most industrial organizations do. And obviously to do this for CIS, they had to go well beyond just the network. So what they did is they deployed essentially a platform and a program, and we worked with them on this, that allowed them to get very, very deep risk assessments on all their assets, both agent-based on some devices like Windows and Unix devices, and agentless where you can't put an agent. They put the teams together. So they had bi-weekly reviews, but they had joint teams. They built a process control team that was focused on this, and then their IT security team. And they met bi-weekly, and they reviewed each security control on a bi-weekly basis and how the progress was going, and they adjusted as necessary as they went. They centrally prioritized actions, so they brought all this data up to the top so they could centrally prioritize what they were going to do from a security point of view. And then importantly, they built a set of defined compensating controls where they were necessary, where exceptions were required. So I can't put antivirus software on a PLC. Okay, what's my compensating control for that? And they defined those and they listed them. We worked with them on that, and they built those compensating controls, and then they measured those so they could know, is the compensating control in place or not? And the short answer at the end of this was they actually achieved their mission of being able to get to that maturity level, measuring all those compensating controls, and building that centralized OT systems management capability. Happy to, in further conversations, go deeper into this, but the main point of this today is to say, this is doable. You know, it requires a mindset, a focus, teamwork, et cetera, but it is very doable to get that same type of security in OT. So let me start with the first point I made earlier, which is the cross-vendor point. Understanding what you can and you cannot do. Oftentimes vendors will say, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do the other thing. And my system is different from their system, and you're going to have my security on this system and somebody else's security. We often say, don't settle. You own your system. You are accountable for the security at the end of the day on the system. The OEM doesn't own it. And so, and this always comes up as particularly when we start talking about how to apply these kind of rigorous IT capabilities, particularly in a way that's efficient. And so making sure that you're pushing back, so to speak, right, that you own your system. bringing IT and OT together in that relationship to find common ground is also very important, because there are some things you cannot do, and understanding those true cannots is important. And then thinking, the last point here, thinking platform and program. So a platform, a cross-vendor platform is almost required if you're going to do this, because otherwise it becomes incredibly inefficient if you're multiple, different security tools depending on what vendor environment you're in. But then the program of how you're going to work across your facilities or across the various controls is equally critical. We talked about visibility, right? So if you're going to do this, the thing to start with is you need to have that deep visibility into your environment to be able to achieve that same level of IT security. And what we talk about when we do this is it's got to get all the way down to those endpoints. And what we mean is, so oftentimes what we hear when we first talk to clients is, well, I have either an Excel spreadsheet of inventory, or I've got some network tools in there that are monitoring and I can see what's talking on the network, et cetera. And we say, that's great, it's helpful, but do you know every user on every device? Do you know the malware, anti-malware status on every device? Do you know every device, whether it be communicating up to the top or communicating just east-west or not communicating at all, which all of those can be risky in the sense of cyber risk. And so if we're going to apply IT security, we have to get down all the way into the network to see. And that's probably not going to be done if all you've got is a spreadsheet that gets updated once a year, or all you've got is a networking tool that's monitoring traffic on the network. And that depth allows us to do a whole bunch of things. Number one, it allows us to see the risk, but number two, it allows us to make those choices about the compensating controls that we've talked about. So knowing what the vulnerability status is of each piece of software, as well as those users' accounts, et cetera, we can start to think about, if I can't patch that system tomorrow, what are the other things I can do? And I can see that whole asset, and I can understand what are the other things that I might be able to do to protect it if I can't patch it right away. So that visibility, absolutely key. The next piece is to think about that visibility or that asset inventory as kind of the center or the cog in a broader IT security management program or OT security management program. We often, as I mentioned, refer to this as OTSM, OT systems management. It's been going on for years in IT. We've been doing systems management in IT for years. But oftentimes, we don't apply that in OT. And so what this chart is getting at is to use that deep asset inventory as your foundation, but then build onto it the other requirements that we talked about at the beginning around things like vulnerability management, patch management, configuration management, user and accounts, and around the horn here. But that asset inventory becomes the fulcrum, the foundation, whatever you want to call it, of enabling all these things. So let me give you an example on vulnerability management. If I have a robust, very deep asset inventory, if I can see every piece of software, if I know the patch status of that software, which I can do, and we'll talk about that, I don't need to scan for vulnerabilities. I don't need to run a Nessus scan or a Rapid7 scan or something like that that could possibly do harm to those PLCs, et cetera. If I already have that asset inventory, I can then know what the vulnerabilities are by having that deep view. That's one example. I can also think about patching because I'm on that network cross-vendor. I can then start to take actions like patching those devices. I can do things like user and account management because I know all the users and I'm right there in the asset inventory. I can start to make changes, and we'll talk about that. So having that asset inventory ends up being not the end, but it's the beginning of the cybersecurity, OT cybersecurity management journey, so to speak. And also one other point on this, back to the platform point, having that integrated. So if you look in the IT world, these are all pretty siloed, right? There's a team that does vulnerability management, another team that does patch management, another team, et cetera. In OT, we don't have that scale. We don't have that many resources. And so we need to think about blowing up those silos and bringing this together in a platform that's something that we can actually get our hands around. Also, we need it because of the compensating control point. It's not going to be every time that we can patch that device within 30 days. Okay, understanding all the picture, we can now think about taking other actions around this machine, so to speak, which allows us to bring together the right compensating control for that particular risk. So I mentioned about patches, right? So this is just one of our dashboards, but basically having that view of all of your patches. These are 3 different, site examples, but being able to bring that patch data together to know it by device. And this isn't just the OS patches, right? This is all of your applications. And it's not just the version of the OS, because that doesn't really tell you what patches have been deployed. But getting into that depth allows you to build a very, very detailed view of what patches are missing on your systems. And importantly, I think one of the things that we often find is, back to this reliance on the OEMs, many of our clients work with vendors, and the vendors will supply approved patches, which, by the way, makes a ton of sense, right? Those patches should be checked and confirmed, and whether you use the vendor to do that or you do it internally on a test bed, whatever. Obviously, control systems are sensitive things, and knowing what a patch is going to do is absolutely critical. The issue is that if you just take that approved list, you don't know, I'll call it the other half of the circle, so to speak, meaning there may be a bunch of vulnerabilities in those devices that just haven't been tested by the vendor. And so by having this view, by looking and seeing all of the patches and all the vulnerabilities, you're not just relying on, okay, well, the vendor tested these things and approved them. Well, what about all the other software that may be on your system that the vendor didn't test? Or alternatively, the devices that haven't been patched because you've got end of life devices. And so by having this fuller picture and not just relying on one vendor to do one system and another vendor to do another, you actually get your full risk picture, which is absolutely critical if you're going to apply that kind of IT type of security into OT. We talked about user and accounts. So when we get into these systems, we almost always find dozens and dozens of accounts with expired passwords, inactive or dormant accounts. One of the things that happens, as for those of you on the OT side know, is during an upgrade process, during an outage, you get a bunch of vendors in. Those vendors are creating accounts on those systems, and the vendors disappear, or whoever it is, right? The contractor, whatever. Okay, what happens to those accounts? If we're not tied into some process in AV where we're managing those on a regular basis, those accounts may live on. And so having that visibility and then the ability to remediate this and get rid of those is critical. And so having that visibility all the way down into those kinds of issues allows us to not just manage a network protection or a network anomaly, but down here into who's got access, admin or not. And so what we encourage then is to say, okay, let's take a 360-degree view of the risks. And what that means is it starts with that inventory, and it goes through all of the elements that we've been talking about. Vulnerability situation. What are the patches on those devices? Are they insecurely configured? User and account. Is my anti-malware up to date? Do I have a network protection on that device or not? What's the criticality of that device? Is it absolutely critical to my performance, or is it something I've got redundant types of those? And what that allows us to do is put a score to it, right? It allows us to put a risk score to that asset. It also allows us to know what are the compensating controls that I could use to reduce the risk, but not do things I can't do. So if I can't patch it right away, okay, if I can harden the config, if I can clean up all the users, if I can make sure my AV is up to date, okay, if I can do those things, can I reduce the risk score of that asset enough? And then monitor them. So that's the first piece of this story, is having that assessment. But then it's only part of the problem, right? I can know it, but I need to be able to do something about it. And this is where the actual application of those IT securities controls comes into play. So the ability to take that inventory, to take that, and this is an example of patching, but to take that patch status and then to actually go through the process of patching it, right? Going through the patch review cycles, the approvals, monitoring if it's not an approved from the vendor when you're doing it yourself, you want to put it on, even if it is approved, you probably want to put it on and monitor it for a period of time, let it soak, and then go through the final process of importing all the patches and deploying them. If you're going to do that on a asset by asset basis, or if you're going to do that on a vendor system by vendor, I mean, we're going to be here forever. You can't, just literally cannot have the resources to do that kind of thing manually. And so the key is back to the platform point. The platform has to be able to allow you to do the assessment, but then allow you to take those actions in a way that's automated. Not automated like automatic, like we're not going to look at it, but automated that when I decide that these patches are ready to go, I literally can push a button and they go. I'm not spending my time literally going with a USB stick device by device, or having, have to have a vendor come in and patch them device by device. I have an automated platform that goes across the environment to be able to take those actions. But to do this is a different architecture, right? A different architecture than perhaps we're used to in IT, but certainly that we're used to in OT. So I'll start at the bottom of this page. You can't do this unless you have some form of an agent in that environment on the Windows type devices. You need that agent to be able to take the actions to get the deep visibility, et cetera. That agent has to be proven though, and it has to be proven across vendors, and it has to be tuned in such a way that it doesn't cause damage to the control system. And we sort of live this life. So we have spent the last 20 years or so tuning an agent for just this purpose. The point is, it's doable. There is a way to do it. It's safe and it's proven. But that doesn't solve the whole problem, because that only gets me to my Windows, Unix, Linux type devices. I then have this fleet of networking devices, PLCs, relays, controllers, IoT devices, smart meters, et cetera. Well, I can't put an agent on those. So what do? You have to have some agentless way of getting to those. And it's not enough to say, I'm just going to monitor what's coming on a span port or what's coming across the network. Because many of those things may be well segmented down in your network, and the cost of getting to all of those with hardware and taps and all the rest that you would need is very expensive. But two, I'm only going to see what they communicate. I need to go and I need to talk to those devices. I need to talk to them in the protocols that those OEMs use. And I need to ask them, send me your data, give me the information from that endpoint so I can get that deep view, so I can do the things I need to do. And then finally, there's a whole bunch of tools that folks already have in their OT environments. You want to integrate that data in. If your vendor, if you're Rockwell, if you're a Rockwell shop and you've got Rockwell devices running Symantec as your antivirus, terrific. We're not going to go say, oh, we got to get rid of Symantec to use something else. No, it's already there. Let's get the data from it. If you use Emerson equipment, you probably got McAfee. Great, let's go get that data. If you've got backups, if you're using a Cronus or something, great, let's get that data. Let's integrate that. If you've got DCS alarm information, let's get that data in so that we have a full, robust picture of all of the information that's available to us. All that then can get integrated at what we call an asset manager level, so that we bring all that data. You've got, in almost every case, we find overlapping IP ranges, et cetera. You have to do some way of bringing that data together to clean it up in an automated way. But then each of those asset managers, different sites, needs to come up to a central place, right? Because if I can't get all of this data centrally, it's going to be really tough to manage and do it efficiently. And so this architecture of vendor agnostic endpoint solution is absolutely critical to being able to bring the IT into OT. Something that looks like IT, right? It uses the same fundamental concepts, but it's done in a way that's proven in OT, that's tuned for OT, and that allows you to take an information-rich view of the assets and the risks, and then eventually take the actions. So that's how we we find the ability to do it. And so, you know, the differences to enable that OTSM from whether it be network management, you know, or basically network protections, i.e. just a firewall, or alternatively network anomaly detection, or alternatively kind of an OEM approach where I got a bunch of different toolkits in there, or worst case manual, right? This approach allows you to get deep into the asset without spending a lot of money on hardware. Number two, allows you to do that 360-degree risk view, so you can make those trade-offs across the different risks, which you have to do because you're going to need to apply compensating controls. Allows you to take actions, to think global, act local, as we've talked about, and then to integrate. So this kind of a platform we see as key to doing it. It's why we built the platform, but our platform. But even if we hadn't built the platform, if we were purely a consulting firm, we'd be telling people you need some kind of a platform like this to make it happen. Organizationally, then, we need to think about this think global, act local concept. And so a number of the questions that we got before this were around, okay, so how do you organize for bringing IT into OT? And our view is you got to use the strengths that you have, right? So by having that top level, that scaled analysis, we can leverage our IT colleagues, right? The IT folks who really understand security to bring prioritization of risks, right? To build playbooks that they've used before in the IT world, to do the controls prioritization, right? To say, okay, if I have a security risk, but I can't do whatever I need to do to remediate that, let's say patch, okay, what are the other things I can do? And so I can scale into a small team, right? I bring all my plants up into one place. I can have a small team analyze that and scale that skill, right? I can do the same thing with monitoring, right? Of all of our host intrusion detections. I can have a scaled team analyzing that. Then if that data is accessible, it's not just sitting in some Splunk instance, you know, at corporate, I can then have regional SMEs work with plants to do things. But then finally, that local plant, right? So that the platform has to allow that plant to be the one who takes those actions, right? Or maybe it's not at a plant level. Maybe your plants are more distributed or environments more distributed. But the point is someone who really understands the process controls of that particular process, knows when the outage is going to be happening, knows if I do this on a weekend, I can get it done, knows those devices are redundant and those aren't, so I can do patching on that. I can take that offline to you know, change the ports and services, whatever it happens to be. But that having that local ability to take actions is key. And by local, again, we don't necessarily mean at the plant. We have some clients who are doing this across 30 or 40 plants. The people who understand those systems is really what we're saying. And so we're using OT and IT for their strengths. We're not trying to make all the OT people into IT security. We're not trying to make all the IT security people into OT experts. I think one of the things that often comes up is this question of skills. What kind of skills do I need? And I think, again, our industry does itself a disservice because we tend to focus on all these fancy names, right? I mean, you got Xenotime and, you know, Trisis and, yeah, anyway, all these names, Stuxnet, everything. And it sounds like you're in some kind of a sci-fi movie. The reality is about 75% of all of the things we're talking about here are basic primary systems management capabilities, right? These are not, I need to have the world's greatest machine learning expert, right? Yeah, there is some of this that does require deep analytical skills, et cetera. But when we talk about building these skills, I think we as an industry scare people, right? It's like, oh, geez, well, you need to have all these trainings and we need to have various credentials and all the rest of that. No, we can do this with fundamental systems management, right? Network architecting skills, right? How do you provision devices and do it securely? Patch management is not rocket science, right? It's not big data. It's not anomaly detection. It's basic, fundamental looking at your vulnerabilities and taking patch actions. networking device management, backup and restore. I mean, one of the most critical things that we can do is to make sure we have backups. Again, it's not fancy, it's just the fundamentals. And I think when we think about the skills that folks need to build, it's 75 or 80% of them are going to be these kinds of skills, which are available. Now, are they widely available? Does everybody, you know, who has a process control background understand these? No, we're not saying that. But they're much more available, let's say, than someone who has 6 different cybersecurity certifications and, you know, has done machine learning modeling on neural networks or something like that. And so these are the kinds of skills we talk about building with our clients, and basically building a roadmap of how do I go from where I am today in my knowledge up to these kinds of capabilities, whether that be training. We do a lot of work with our clients where we're essentially doing kind of almost like a build, operate, transfer, where we're building a team for them. We're helping them gain the skills internally, and then we're sort of transferring over that management of this to the client. Essentially build those capabilities and create a pipeline of folks that can eventually operate this long term. Now, on the bottom, there certainly are some of these analysis skills, but again, this is where we say, look, leverage our IT colleagues, bring that up into that central team where you have a few folks who have those really deep and advanced skills to do those more analytical and investigative type skills. And so I'm just going to end here with the possibility. So this is one of our clients who was using the NIST framework. You know, we've seen this done with IEC 62443, with NIST, with NERC-CIP, with CIS. You pick your favorite standard. But what they did is they evaluated themselves prior to beginning this program around bringing IT into OT, right? And you can see the blue bars of where they were. And then they applied this kind of an approach with a platform and a program to go after the capabilities of bringing IT capabilities into OT. And they saw essentially a 2x improvement in their overall security maturity. Now, people will argue, well, security maturity doesn't equal security. Got it. That's absolutely right? You have to ensure that those things that you're doing are up to date. You got to ensure that you're got policies and procedures, that you've got detections, et cetera, a whole bunch of things that need to go into that. But by measuring your maturity, you can start to get a sense for, am I making progress? Am I moving towards a more secure position than I was in before? And the reality is, it is doable. You can do this, and we've seen it done in multiple different situations. So with that, we've got about 10 minutes. I promised a few minutes for questions. Hopefully some folks have some questions. There were some that were sent in ahead of time, and so I may try and answer some of those. Then I'm going to try to open my Q&A here and see if anyone has got any questions to come. Let me just do this. Hold on one second. Boom. So one of the questions that had come in before our event, okay, we got some in the chat. So one of the questions that came in before was around the how do I get a how do I partner between IT and OT? And so let me just talk a little bit about that. So let me give you one example how a company did this. So they had they really wanted to bring this IT and OT together more closely. And so what they did is they created a group within the organization that was responsible for broadly the OT and IT security. And they had they had 3 leaders in that group, 2 of them from the IT side, and then one of them who had 35 years of experience running plants and had worked up to running multiple plants, and then was most recently responsible for a number of their security compliance, reliability compliance type things. And that person came in and he became the head of security architecture, not just OT, all security architecture. And then he was the subject matter expert to be responsible for the OT as well. And what that did is, and then he built a team, and his team was mostly OT folks. What that did is it forced these people to come together on a regular basis and debate the challenges. And they got to know each other. They went to dinners together. They became part of the same organization with the same goals, brought out of each side, I'll call it, of this divide. Incredibly successful, incredibly successful. We actually did a whole webinar on this probably 3 weeks ago around OT is from Mars and IT is from Venus, basically saying there's two different planets and how do you get them to work together. Happy if folks are interested to see that. You can either go to our website or send us an email, and we're happy to send you that document, but a lot about culture. What's the nature of the evolving attacks? We talked a little bit about this. I think one of the things that we're seeing right now is with COVID and lockdowns, and particularly the growing acceleration, maybe it's the way I put it, the acceleration of Industrial 4.0, Industry 4.0, IoT, whatever, that I think COVID has really jump-started. We are seeing much, much more remote connectivity into these environments. And if we think about this, right, most OT environments have really thought about security at the perimeter level, right? They've said, look, I'm gonna do one of two things, or maybe both. I'm gonna have a really rigorous network protection schema at the perimeter. I may, by the way, also have sub-segmentation inside, right? I may have some Purdue model inside. And then what I'm gonna have is I'm gonna do some form of network-based anomaly detection, right? So there are a couple of the kind of key things people do. And by the way, those things are great. We're not arguing against those. But what happens is in a world where you've got a lot more connectivity, managing those security, if that's all you've got, it's a really, really risky play, because you now have a lot more connectivity that you have to manage, multiple vendors coming in. I mean, you just think about the anomalies are going off the charts, right? What's an anomaly and what's not? You got to start to protect the inside. That soft middle, the M&M again, right? Crunchy on the outside, soft on the inside. We are finding more and more that people are getting through that network protection, and without the ability to manage those endpoints and apply these kind of IT security principles in the OT environment, we are completely at risk. And that's only going to get worse, right? These connections are going to get more and more and more. By the way, we have to, right? We have to get there from an efficiency point of view, a productivity point of view, probably even a safety point of view. Well, if we're going to do that, we got to balance the other side of it. We got to make the investments on the endpoint security if we're going to do that. Another question that came in before was around smart metering and IoT and some of the other devices like that. So we've spent a lot of time working on that. There's a couple of notes on that. We talked before about our agentless capabilities and what you need to do to get to some of these embedded devices. These IoT devices are perfect examples of that, right? It's one thing to know the communication that's going on. It's another to know the exact data on those devices. The great news is there are ways of doing that, right? We can communicate with those devices and gather back that data. In addition, there are a range of, I'll call it, places in the network that one can go to gather the key data that you need as to where it's held, whether it be at the head ends, at relay points, et cetera. Much longer conversation. But the reality is these devices are at risk. There's no question, because again, more networks are being open. Many of them are connected through wireless, maybe 5G, 4G type networks. And so that agentless capability is key. Now, can you patch them right away? Can you do it? Probably not, right? You're going to have some methodology for compensating controls on those devices. By the way, and there are a lot of those around user and account management and encryption and that sort of thing. Those devices are clearly one of the things you have to do with that agentless approach. Let me just look here, one more. And one of the questions that came in is, it just came in the chat, who are our main competitors in this industry? So I think what I'd say is the main approaches that folks use for this are these anomaly, the things we see often in when we're talking with customers, are these anomaly detection approaches, the passive tools, right? The Nozomis, Clarities, people like that, where they're gathering data at the network layer. We would argue, that is a quote unquote competitor of ours in the sense that, yes, people are making a trade-off of this. Obviously, our point of view is that doesn't really get you the kind of security you need inside on those endpoints. And obviously, the other folks who do this are the OEMs themselves. And we've talked about that, right? The challenges of being reliant on an OEM specifically for, for their set of equipment. It's fine maybe for their set of equipment, but one of our clients had, I think, 8 or 9 different OEM vendors, and they had 30 different sites. And he's like, there's no way I can manage whatever that is, 180 different types of control system security. And by the way, none of that rolled up into a central thing. So just the labor requirements of that were impossible. And so those are typically who we bump into in the space. But obviously, this approach that we've talked about is pretty different from either of those models.